John Wayne Gacy. To his neighbors, he was a cheerful contractor who dressed as a clown for children's parties. Beneath his house lay one of the worst discoveries in American criminal history. Between 1972 and 1978, John Wayne Gacy murdered at least 33 young men and boys in the Chicago area. A successful builder who ran his own contracting firm, was active in local Democratic politics, and performed at parties and hospitals as a character he called Pogo the Clown. Gacy lured many of his victims with the offer of construction work or some other ruse, overpowered them once they were inside his home, and strangled them. The great majority of the bodies he concealed in the crawl space beneath his own home, 26 in all, with several others buried elsewhere on his property, and the last few discarded in a nearby river. For years he killed without drawing suspicion, a familiar and well-liked figure in his quiet suburb. He hosted neighborhood parties and shook hands with local dignitaries even as the crawl space filled beneath them. The killing that undid him was the disappearance of a teenage boy, Robert Piest, in December 1978. The boy had last been seen leaving to meet Gacy about a job. Officers looking into the contractor found that he had an earlier conviction in Iowa for assaulting a teenage boy, for which he had served time before being paroled, and they obtained a warrant to search his home. What they uncovered in the crawl space turned a missing persons inquiry into a mass murder investigation that stunned the country. How had so many young people vanished from a single area without anyone connecting them to the man at its center? Investigators eventually recovered the remains of dozens of victims, many of them runaways or young workers whose disappearances had never been linked to one another. Some had worked for his company, others he had drawn in with offers of money or a job. The kind of young men whose absence drew little official attention at the time. The dead were so numerous, and so many had fallen through the cracks of the era, that identifying them all proved impossible at the time, and that work continues to this day. The case also became foundational for the FBI. After his conviction, agents from the Bureau's Behavioral Science Unit, including the pioneering profiler John Douglas, interviewed Gacy in prison as part of the landmark study of serial offenders that shaped modern criminal profiling. He was not caught by a profile. Rather, what he and others revealed in those interviews helped agents learn to recognize the men who commit such crimes before they can kill so many. The Gacy interviews became part of the bedrock of the Bureau's understanding of serial murder. Who was he? Gacy had grown up under an abusive, alcoholic father and had built an outwardly respectable life, marrying, running a business, and involving himself in local politics and neighborhood events in his clown persona. He had once managed restaurants in Iowa before returning to the Chicago area to start his contracting company. The very picture of a self-made man. That ordinary, sociable exterior was precisely what allowed him to operate for so long. The gap between the smiling party entertainer and the predator beneath the floorboards gave the case its grim nickname, the Killer Clown. Arrested in December 1978, Gacy was tried and convicted in 1980 of all 33 murders and sentenced to death. His attempt to claim insanity was rejected by the jury, who found he had known exactly what he was doing. The trial laid out a pattern of killings far too organized and too carefully concealed to be the work of a man who did not understand his own actions. Gacy was executed in 1994, but the case did not close with his death. Working with DNA and genetic genealogy, the Cook County Sheriff's Office reopened the long effort to name his unidentified victims, and in recent years, several have finally been identified, including one man confirmed in 2021 through genetic genealogy, more than 4 decades after he was killed. His family finally notified that autumn. 5 of Gacy's victims still remain unnamed, and the effort to give them back their identities and their stories goes on. The next case involved not one predator, but 2. who found each other behind bars and planned their crimes together before either was free. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris. Two violent men met in prison and made a pact. When they were released, they set out to carry it out together. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris met while both were serving time at a California state prison, where they discovered a shared appetite for violence and agreed that, once they were both free, they would act out together what they had only talked about apart. Over 5 months in 1979, the pair abducted and murdered 5 teenage girls across Southern California, using a van they had specially fitted out for their crimes and given a grim nickname. Their own nickname, the Toolbox Killers, came from the ordinary household tools they carried, the use of which is too disturbing to recount here. What matters for the record is the scale and the calculation of it. 5 young lives taken over a single summer and autumn by 2 men acting in concert. 2 of their 5 victims were never recovered, leaving those families without even the certainty of a burial. The crimes might have gone on far longer had Norris not talked. He boasted about what the pair had done to a man he had known in prison, who went to the police. That account led investigators straight to the 2 men and gave them the evidence to build a case. Police were able to recover items and records that corroborated the informant's story. After months in which young women had disappeared with no answers, it was a careless boast, not a clue at the scene, that finally exposed them. The pair had been careful at the scenes themselves, leaving little for police to work with. The case earned a singular place in FBI history through the words of John Douglas, the Bureau's pioneering profiler. Douglas, who interviewed and studied many of the country's worst offenders over his career, described Bittaker as the most disturbing individual for whom he ever created a profile. It was not a profile that caught the pair, an informant did that. But the characterization captured just how extreme their crimes were. Even measured against the men the FBI had made it its work to understand. Douglas had sat across from many of the worst killers of his era, which made his verdict on Bittaker all the more striking. Who were they? Bittaker was reportedly highly intelligent, said to have a notably high recorded score on intelligence tests. Yet he had a criminal record stretching back deep into his youth. Norris had a history of violent sexual offenses and had spent time confined in a state hospital long before the 2 ever met. Apart, each was dangerous. Together, they encouraged and amplified the very worst in one another, turning a shared fantasy hatched in a cell into a methodical campaign of abduction and murder. Investigators came to believe neither man would have killed on this scale without the other. What turns 2 separate men into something far more lethal than either could be alone? Their case remains one of the starkest and most chilling answers on record. Studied for decades by criminologists, the partnership became a grim textbook example of how 2 offenders can spur each other past every limit. Both were arrested in November 1979. Norris accepted a plea deal and testified against his partner, receiving a sentence of 45 years to life. His testimony, describing how the crimes had unfolded, became the center of the case against Bittaker. Bittaker was convicted on many counts, including 5 of murder, and sentenced to death. He never expressed remorse, and in the years that followed, he became notorious for taunting the families of his victims from prison. The man Douglas had singled out as the worst he ever profiled would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Neither man was ever executed. Bittaker died of natural causes on death row in 2019, and Norris died in prison the following year. The pact the 2 had made in a prison cell ended decades later, in the same kind of place it had begun, with both of them dying behind bars for what they had done. Norris, who had testified for the prosecution, had at least carried the prospect of parole. Bittaker never did. The next case moved to the Alaskan wilderness, and a respected businessman who turned the land itself into a hunting ground. Robert Hansen. In Anchorage, he was a mild, well-liked baker who held local hunting records. The hunting he was proudest of, no one knew about. Robert Hansen, originally from Iowa, ran a successful bakery in Anchorage, Alaska, and seemed an unremarkable, soft-spoken family man. But between the early 1970s and 1983, Hansen abducted and murdered women, most of them dancers and sex workers who had come north to Anchorage during the oil pipeline boom. These were women whose disappearances, in that transient boomtown, were easy to overlook and slow to be investigated. In his most chilling method, he flew victims out to remote country near a wilderness river, set them loose, and hunted them down with a rifle as though they were game. A practiced pilot and outdoorsman, he used his own small plane to reach country where no one would hear or find anything. He would later confess to killing 17 women over more than a decade. Only some of the bodies were ever recovered, many from shallow graves in the country he knew so well. Hansen's undoing came in 1983, when a teenage girl he had abducted managed to escape and described to police what he had done and where he had taken her. Her account, at first met with doubt because of who she was and who he appeared to be, gave investigators the thread they needed to pull. An Alaska state trooper led the case, and slowly the net began to close around the respectable baker whom almost no one in town suspected. The trooper kept building the case piece by piece, convinced the friendly businessman was hiding something monstrous. This is one of the clearest examples of FBI profiling actually working. The Bureau's Behavioral Science Unit, working with John Douglas, built a profile of the unknown killer as an experienced hunter with low self-esteem, an affliction such as a stutter, a history of rejection by women, and a habit of keeping souvenirs from his victims. The profile fit Hansen closely and is credited as instrumental in focusing the investigation on him. It described, almost point for point, the quiet baker the trooper had begun to suspect. Here, unlike in so many cases, a profile genuinely helped identify the man. Who was he? Hansen had been bullied as a young man over a stutter and severe acne, and had carried a deep resentment of women ever since. Rejection had curdled into something violent and durable, and he carried it with him to Alaska. His record reached back to an arson conviction in his youth, for which he had served time and during which he had been diagnosed with serious psychological problems. In Alaska, he had remade himself as a pillar of the community, a churchgoer and a record-setting hunter, the last man his neighbors would ever have suspected. He had a wife and children and a clean public face, and he hid behind all of it. That double life was the whole point. The friendly baker and the wilderness predator were one and the same. By day he sold bread to the same community he was terrorizing by night. Arrested in 1983, Hansen agreed to a plea deal, confessing to 17 murders and guiding investigators to bodies hidden in the wilderness. He was convicted of 4 and sentenced to 461 years plus life, with no possibility of release. The 4 were the cases prosecutors could prove beyond doubt, among them women named Sherry Morrow and Paula Goulding, though by his own admission, there were many more. The hunting records he had been so proud of were eclipsed by the far darker tally he finally admitted. He had kept items belonging to his victims, trophies of a kind, just as the FBI profile had predicted. Hansen died of natural causes in custody in 2014. The work of identifying his victims carried on after his death. In 2021, a woman whose remains had been known only by a nickname for decades, was at last identified through genetic genealogy, returning a name to one more of the women he had killed, and offering her family a measure of answers after almost 40 years. The next case is the strongest example of FBI profiling on this list, and also its most bitterly disputed. Wayne Williams. For 2 years, a wave of killings terrified Atlanta. The case produced one of the FBI's most famous profiles and one of its most lasting controversies. Between 1979 and 1981, at least 28 black children, teenagers, and young adults were murdered in Atlanta, in a wave of killings that gripped the city in fear. Most of the victims were boys and young men from poor neighborhoods, and as the toll climbed, the failure to stop the deaths became a national scandal and a source of deep anguish in the city's black community. Parents kept their children indoors as the body count rose and the killer stayed unknown. The murders drew national attention, federal involvement, and a fear that gripped the whole city. As the investigation struggled, the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, led by the profiler John Douglas, drew up a profile of the likely offender. Breaking with the assumptions of many at the time, Douglas concluded the killer was probably a young black man operating inside the community rather than an outside racist. It was a controversial conclusion in a city already raw with racial tension. The profile would prove central to the case, and Douglas also advised prosecutors on how to question the eventual suspect in a way designed to provoke his temper in front of the jury. The work made the case a landmark in the Bureau's history. In May 1981, police staking out a bridge over the Chattahoochee River heard a splash and stopped a car leaving the area. The driver was Wayne Williams, a young aspiring music promoter. Fibers recovered from victims were later matched to fibers from Williams' home and car, and that fiber evidence became the backbone of the case against him. 2 days after the bridge stop, the body of one of the adult victims was recovered from the river downstream. Williams was convicted in 1982, but only of 2 murders, both of them adult men, Nathaniel Cater, 27, and Jimmy Ray Payne, 21. The prosecution argued a pattern linking him to the wider series and presented fiber evidence said to tie him to a number of the victims. He was never charged with any of the child murders at all. That distinction between the crimes he was convicted of and the many more attributed to him sits at the very heart of the controversy. After his conviction, police attributed many of the other deaths to him and administratively closed those cases. But that decision was, and remains, fiercely disputed. Critics have questioned the strength of the fiber evidence, the reliability of some witnesses, and whether other possible suspects were ever properly investigated, and some victims' families and advocates have long doubted his guilt. Others point out that the wave of killings stopped after his arrest, and most law enforcement officials have continued to maintain that he was responsible. The case has been argued over ever since, in courtrooms, books, and documentaries. Even the FBI's own profiler drew consequences. After Douglas publicly suggested Williams was responsible for many of the killings, he received an official letter of censure from the FBI director. Who is he now? Williams, the son of 2 school teachers and a one-time aspiring broadcaster and music promoter, has always maintained his innocence. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms and remains in a Georgia prison, now in his 60s. His appeals over the decades, including later federal challenges, have all been rejected. He was denied parole in 2019, the board citing insufficient time served, with his next eligibility years away. He will not be considered again until the end of the decade at the earliest. That same year, The city's mayor and police chief reopened the murders, and investigators later sent DNA evidence from the old cases away for fresh testing using methods that had not existed in the 1980s. As of today, no official results have been released, no new charges have been filed, and no one has been exonerated. The case that gave the FBI one of its proudest profiling moments remains, decades on, one of its most haunting open questions. For the families of the children who died, the lack of a final, definitive answer is its own enduring wound. If you have made it this far and you are enjoying these cases, take a moment to subscribe, because the stories only get stranger from here. The next case belonged to a very different kind of predator, one who found his victims not on the street, but on the early internet. John Edward Robinson. He was a Midwestern family man and a lifelong con artist. He was also the first serial killer known to hunt his victims on the internet. Between 1984 and the year 2000, John Edward Robinson murdered at least 8 women across Kansas and Missouri. A practiced fraudster, embezzler, and forger who projected the image of a settled family man. Robinson lured his victims with promises of jobs, money, and relationships. He had spent his whole adult life running scams and cons, always one identity ahead of the people he cheated. What set him apart was how he found them. Using the alias Slave Master, he trawled the early internet's chat rooms, making him widely described as the first known serial killer to use the internet to seek out the people he would kill. The methods behind the deaths were as cold as the man. Robinson stored the bodies of victims in large sealed barrels, some on a rural property he kept in Kansas, others in a rented storage unit across the state line in Missouri. It was the discovery of those barrels that would finally lay the scale of his crimes bare. For years, the disappearances went unconnected, in part because Robinson chose women whose absence might not quickly raise an alarm, and in part because he spun convincing stories to those who asked after them. How could a familiar suburban figure move bodies into barrels and keep that secret for the better part of 2 decades? One of his crimes reached even further into another life. After killing a young mother, Robinson arranged the secret, falsified adoption of her infant daughter, who was raised for years by relatives of his, unaware of where she had truly come from. The girl grew up with no knowledge that the man who had placed her had murdered her mother. It was a detail that, when it finally emerged, captured the chilling reach of his deception. Robinson was arrested in the year 2000 in Olathe, Kansas, initially on lesser complaints from women who had come forward. Searches of his properties then uncovered the barrels and a trail of digital evidence that turned a local case into the unmasking of a serial killer. Among the dead were women who had traveled to meet him, believing they were starting a new chapter of their lives. The internet that had been his hunting ground also helped seal his fate, leaving records that investigators could follow. The FBI's connection here is more a matter of study than of capture. The case is frequently cited in bureau training and profiling discussions, but it was victim complaints and local police work that brought Robinson down, not a profile drawn up to catch him. Still, as the first internet-era serial killer, he became an important figure in how the FBI thinks about offenders who use technology to find their victims. Who was he? Robinson had been an Eagle Scout as a boy and a smooth operator all his adult life, a husband and father who ran frauds behind a respectable front. That ability to charm and deceive was the engine of his crimes. He could persuade a woman to travel to meet him and persuade everyone around her that nothing was wrong. By the time anyone grew suspicious, he had usually moved the story along again. Tried in Kansas in 2002, in one of the longest criminal trials in the state's history, Robinson was convicted of capital murder for 2 of the women and of further murder counts, receiving death sentences. Prosecutors laid out a pattern of deception and killing stretching back more than 15 years. In a later plea deal in Missouri, he admitted to additional killings and received multiple life terms, confirming that his hunting ground had spanned 2 states. Years afterward, a state court set aside some of the convictions on technical grounds, but left his capital sentence intact. Robinson, now in his 80s, remains on death row in Kansas, a state that has not carried out an execution in generations. The con man who turned the early internet into a tool for murder is likely to die behind bars. His sentence never carried out, but never lifted. He has continued to fight his convictions through the courts, so far without success. The next killer needed no internet and no clever disguise. When police finally entered his apartment, what they found horrified the world. Jeffrey Dahmer. His name became shorthand for human evil itself, invoked for decades in books, films, and television. The scene police discovered in his apartment remains among the most disturbing in American criminal history. Between 1978 and 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer killed 17 men and boys, most of them Black, Asian, or Latino, in Ohio and Wisconsin. He lured many of his victims to his home with offers of money or the promise of photographs, drugged them, and killed them. Many were young men he met in bars or on the street. The kind of victims whose disappearances drew too little attention for too long. The full nature of what he did to his victims, both before and after death, was so gruesome that it remains difficult to describe. And out of respect for the dead, it is enough to say it shocked even hardened investigators. What is important for the record is the scale. 17 lives taken, and the years of failures that let it continue. His first killing, of a young man named Stephen Hicks, came in 1978. The rest followed years later after he settled in Milwaukee. After that first murder, he served briefly in the Army, then returned to Wisconsin, where his killing resumed and accelerated. There was a moment when it might all have been stopped. In 1991, a teenage boy who had escaped Dahmer was encountered by Milwaukee police on the street, dazed and in distress. Rather than recognize what was happening, the officers returned the boy to Dahmer, who killed him. The 2 officers involved were later dismissed, and the episode became a lasting symbol of how the warning signs around Dahmer and around the vulnerable men he targeted were repeatedly missed. Neighbors had complained of strange sights and smells from his apartment. But nothing was ever pieced together in time. How many lives might have been saved if that one boy had been believed? It was one of several chances to stop him that slipped away. The end finally came in July 1991, when an intended victim, Tracy Edwards, escaped and flagged down police, leading them back to the apartment. Inside, officers found the evidence of his crimes and the photographs he had taken. It was a scene so disturbing that those who entered the apartment would never forget it. The discovery turned a single escape into the exposure of years of killing. The FBI's link to Dahmer, as with Gacy, came after his arrest rather than before it. He was caught by Milwaukee police, not by a profile. But he was among the offenders later studied by the Bureau's behavioral experts as they worked to understand what drives such men. What he told investigators and psychiatrists about himself fed directly into the science of profiling. His case became part of the grim library that informs modern profiling. Who was he? Dahmer had grown withdrawn and troubled in his youth, an alcoholic fixated on death from an early age. By his teens, he was already deeply disturbed, and that disturbance hardened over the years into something monstrous. Yet at trial, the question was not whether he was strange, but whether he was legally insane. A jury rejected his insanity defense and found him legally sane, accepting the prosecution's argument that he had planned his crimes carefully and known exactly what he was doing, taking deliberate steps to avoid being caught. The verdict meant he was held fully responsible, a sane man who had chosen to do what he did. In 1992, Dahmer was convicted and sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, with a further life sentence added for the earlier Ohio murder. The sheer number of terms reflected the sheer number of his victims. He would never be released. There was no death penalty available in Wisconsin, so the long stack of life terms was the most the court could impose. The man whose name had come to embody horror was now to spend the rest of his life in prison. That life proved short. In 1994, Dahmer was beaten to death by a fellow inmate at a Wisconsin prison, dying at the age of 34. The case that had gripped and sickened the world ended not with an execution, but at the hands of another prisoner. His death closed the story, but answered none of the questions about how he had been allowed to kill for so long. The next case involved a man who built an entire structure dedicated to his crimes, yet was never convicted of a single murder. David Parker Ray. He built a soundproof trailer for one purpose. Investigators came to believe he had used it on dozens of women, yet he was never convicted of a single murder. For years in the desert around a small New Mexico town, David Parker Ray kidnapped and tortured women inside a custom-built, soundproof trailer he called his toy box, which he had fitted out specifically for his crimes. A maintenance worker by trade, married several times, Ray operated with the help of two accomplices, his own daughter and his girlfriend. The pair helped him select and control victims, drawing two more people into his long campaign of cruelty. Authorities later came to suspect he may have killed as many as several dozen victims over the years. But here lies the strange heart of the case. No bodies and no definitive evidence of any murder were ever recovered. Ray himself was said to have spoken of dozens of abductions, yet not one death could ever be tied to him in a way that would stand in court. The case broke open in 1999 when one of his captives, Cynthia Vigil, escaped and, still bound, ran into the road to flag down help and reach the police. Her account led investigators to Ray's property and to the trailer, exposing a hidden operation that had run for far longer than anyone realized. What they found inside confirmed that everything she had described was real. Without her courage and luck, it is unclear whether Ray would ever have been stopped. He had been careful, and there was little else pointing investigators his way. The FBI's connection to the case is real but limited, and worth stating plainly rather than overselling. Years earlier, Ray's own daughter had reportedly tried to warn the Bureau about her father, but the allegations were thought too vague to act on at the time. Much later, after his arrest, the FBI helped publicize images of recovered items in an effort to identify possible victims. Those images were meant to jog memories and connect Ray to women who had vanished, though firm answers proved hard to find. This was not a case cracked by a classic behavioral profile. It was broken by a woman who got away. The honest version of the FBI's role here is a modest one, not the dramatic profile that television now often promises. Who was he? Ray had served in the military and held down steady work for the local parks department, an unremarkable figure to those who knew him casually. He lived for years near a quiet lakeside town, blending into a community that had no idea what he was. Behind that ordinary surface, he had spent years and considerable effort constructing a place designed for prolonged, deliberate cruelty, a level of planning that set his case apart even among the worst offenders. He had prepared his tools and equipment in advance, treating his crimes with the cold method of a project. Ray was arrested in 1999, and in a later plea deal, he was sentenced to 223 years for the kidnapping and torture of 2 women. Crucially, he was never convicted of murder, since no killing could ever be proven against him. It remains one of the most unsettling features of the case. A man widely believed to be a killer who was punished only for what his surviving victims could describe. The surviving victims who testified, among them Cynthia Vigil, ensured he would not walk free again. Their willingness to describe what had been done to them was what finally held him to account. Ray died of a heart attack in custody in 2002, shortly before he was due to be questioned further, taking whatever full truth he knew to the grave. He had reportedly offered to talk in exchange for leniency for his daughter, but died before that conversation could happen. His girlfriend and accomplice was sentenced to a long term, testified against him, and was eventually released after roughly 2 decades. His daughter received a shorter sentence and served only a few years. Both accomplices outlived him, their later lives shadowed by what they had taken part in. What exactly happened to the women Ray was suspected of killing has never been established, leaving the case, decades on, suspended between horror and uncertainty. Families of missing women in the region have never had the certainty they sought, and the toy box killer remains a byword for cruelty whose true death toll, if there was one, will never be known. The final case is the most recent of all. A killer who hid in plain sight on Long Island for more than a decade. Rex Heuermann. For more than a decade, the remains of women appeared along a lonely stretch of Long Island Highway. The man responsible was an architect, living a quiet suburban life not far away. The case dates to 2010, when police searching for a missing woman found human remains along Ocean Parkway on Long Island, New York. In all, around 11 sets of remains were eventually recovered in or near that road. The discoveries, made over several years, turned a remote parkway into one of the most notorious crime scenes in the country. Prosecutors say that, over a span reaching from 1993 to 2010, Rex Heuermann strangled women, many of them sex workers he contacted through anonymous burner phones, and that he kept a deleted document on his computer that functioned as a chilling checklist for committing and concealing murder. That document, prosecutors said, read like a planning guide, a methodical breakdown of how to carry out a killing and avoid leaving a trace. The investigation that finally identified him was strikingly modern. A multi-agency task force formed in 2022, including the FBI and the state police, used cell phone location data, analysis of vehicles and burner phones, and genetic genealogy to identify victims and narrow the field of suspects. Years after the bodies were found, advances in DNA technology breathed new life into a case that had gone cold and embarrassed local authorities. A decisive break came when investigators matched DNA from a discarded pizza crust Heuermann had thrown away to hairs found on victims, tying the respectable architect to the killings. It was the same kind of discarded DNA tactic that has cracked other modern cases. A suspect undone by something he tossed in the trash. How had a married professional, running his own Manhattan firm, hidden such a secret for so many years? He had commuted into the city, raised a family, and run a business, all while prosecutors say he was killing. Who was he? Heuermann was an architectural consultant who had run his own business for about 3 decades and lived an outwardly conventional life in the same Long Island town where he had grown up, with a wife and children. To neighbors and colleagues, he was an ordinary, if imposing, suburban figure. He was a large man with a family and a long professional career, the last person most would have suspected. That very ordinariness was what had let him operate undetected for so long. Even as bodies were being found on a highway, he drove regularly. He lived close enough to the scene to watch the investigation unfold around him for years. Heuermann was arrested in 2023, at first charged with a small number of the murders, with charges expanding as investigators built their case and identified more victims through DNA. His arrest, after more than a decade of dead ends, made headlines around the world. The defense fought the new forensic techniques, but pretrial rulings went against him. A judge ruled the cutting-edge DNA evidence admissible, a serious blow to his case, clearing the way for all the charges to be tried together. Then, in April 2026, Heuermann pleaded guilty to 7 of the murders and admitted responsibility for an 8th, abandoning his scheduled trial and effectively accepting that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. The plea spared the families a lengthy trial and the uncertainty of a verdict. The 8 women he admitted killing, some of whose cases had gone unsolved for decades, finally had his name attached to their deaths. Among them was a woman killed as far back as 1993, the earliest of the crimes he confessed to. As of this telling, Heuermann was due to be formally sentenced in June 2026 to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. His former wife announced she would not attend the hearing. As part of his plea, he agreed to cooperate with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, the modern successor to the profilers who studied the killers of earlier generations. It was a fitting bookend. The same bureau that had built its understanding on men like Gacy and Dahmer, now sitting down with one of the most notorious killers of the present day. Investigators believe he may be responsible for still more deaths, given a long gap in the timeline of his admitted crimes. For the families of the Gilgo Beach victims, his guilty plea brought answers long denied, even as the work of accounting for every victim of the killings is not yet finished. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.